welcome back to Black by Design. Before I get started, I want to ask a simple question. Where does healing begin for Black people? Most of us grew up learning Black history through pain. We learned about slavery, we learned about lynching, we learned about segregation, we learned about civil rights violence. But almost nobody taught us what happens after the pain. But before I get into that, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode of Black by Design. So, what happens after the pain? Well, nobody really taught us how Black people were allowed to grieve. No one taught us what healing looked like for our ancestors. Nobody taught us what to do with emotional wounds that never really got time to close. We were taught how to survive, we were taught how to be strong, and we were taught how to keep pushing. But we weren't taught what to do with that weight. So a lot of people in the Black community feel this tension. Why does grief feel so heavy? Why does healing feel so complicated? Why does being vulnerable feel unsafe? And why does sadness feel like a weakness? And here's the truth. It's not that Black people don't want to heal. No, it's that for generations, we were never really shown how. So today, I'm going to talk about three things. One is why grief is so hard in the Black community. 2, the hidden history of Black trauma and healing. And then 3, where healing can actually begin for us today. Not in theory, not in slogans, but in real life. So why is grief so hard in the Black community? So let's start here. Why does grief feel so complicated for Black people? Grief feels complicated for Black people because it was shaped by history, survival, and silence, not just personal loss. For generations, Black people weren't given the space to grieve in healthy or open ways. During slavery, families were separated, loved ones died, and there was no time for or permission to stop and mourn. Survival came first. Pain had to be swallowed just to make it through the day. Over time, that created a cultural lesson. Keep moving, don't break down, and be strong. Grief and survival were never separate. For Black people in slavery, grief had no space. If your child was sold away, you didn't have time to mourn. If your spouse was taken, you didn't have time to collapse. If someone died, you didn't get funerals the way others did. Grief had to be swallowed because survival demanded movement. You had to wake up, you had to work, and you had to keep living inside a system that didn't care for what you felt. So strength became the language of survival. Not because Black people were naturally stronger. No, I'm not saying that. But because weakness was never safe. And that mindset didn't disappear after slavery. During Jim Crow, showing pain could make you a target. Breaking down could be seen as instability. And vulnerability could be weaponized. So grief became private. And then came the Civil Rights era. We celebrate the marches, we celebrate the leaders, we celebrate the victories. But we don't talk enough about the trauma. You know, the bombings, the assassinations, the children attacked by dogs, families losing loved ones. There was no national therapy session for that. The message was, again, keep going, keep fighting, and don't stop. So generation after generation learned you don't sit with pain, you push through it. And that became cultural. That becomes family language. You know, the be strong, don't cry, pray about it, handle it. Other people had it worse. I'm sure you've heard many of those. Those phrases didn't come from cruelty, they came from survival. But survival and healing are not the same thing. Survival keeps you alive, but healing lets you feel alive. This created what scholars now call intergenerational trauma. Pain passed down not just biologically, but culturally. So now, did you know Black Americans are 20% more likely to experience serious psychological distress than white Americans? Black adults are about half as likely to receive mental health treatment. Black men's suicide rates have quadrupled since the 1960s, and only 4% of psychologists in the United States are Black. So, speaking of intergenerational trauma, let's unpack that. Because it explains why grief and emotional patterns don't start with us, but they happen to still live inside us. Intergenerational trauma is the emotional and psychological impact of trauma that gets passed down from one generation to the next. Not through stories alone, but through behavior, beliefs, and survival strategies. In the context of Black grief and healing, it helps answer a big question. Why do certain emotional habits feel inherited? Like being taught not to cry, feeling guilty for resting, avoiding hard conversations, believing strength means silence, carrying anxiety without even knowing why. Those didn't just come out of nowhere. They came from ancestors who had to survive slavery, Jim Crow, racial violence, and constant instability. They learned emotional rules that kept them alive. don't draw attention, don't appear weak, don't trust outsiders, and keep moving forward. Those rules made sense in dangerous situations, but when passed down without any context, they turn into emotional barriers. So today's grief isn't just about losing a loved one, personal pain, or individual sadness. It's layered with historical loss, unprocessed trauma, family silence, cultural expectations, and that fear of vulnerability. That's why grief can feel heavier and more complicated in the Black community. You're not just grieving one thing, you're touching generations of unfinished mourning. Intergenerational trauma also explains why healing can feel unfamiliar. Many Black families were never taught how to talk about feelings, how to name trauma, how to seek help safely, and even how to rest without fear. Instead, they were taught how to endure, how to pray, how to work, how to laugh it off, and how to keep it inside. Those were survival tools, not emotional tools. Understanding intergenerational trauma shifts the narrative from what's wrong with us to what happened to us. It reframes grief as historical and not personal failure. It reframes healing as learning new emotional language, breaking silence, creating safer spaces, and choosing a different pattern. Healing doesn't mean rejecting our ancestors. No. It means honoring their survival while choosing something softer for ourselves. So intergenerational trauma is relevant because it connects Black history, Black grief, and Black healing into one continuous story. It tells us grief doesn't begin with us, but healing can. So when people ask, why does grief feel different in the Black community? Well, it's because grief was never allowed to be soft. It had to be quiet, it had to be hidden, it had to be productive. And so that brings us to our next part, the hidden history of Black trauma and healing. Now, this is the part that doesn't get taught enough. Black people have always healed, just not the ways in which modern society recognizes. Healing showed up in culture. Like, it showed up in spirituals, it showed up in gospel, it showed up in blues, it showed up in jazz, it even showed up in hip hop. Music became grief with rhythm, pain with melody, memory with movement. Church became more than religion. It became therapy before therapy even existed. It became community care. It became a place to cry when the world said don't. Food became healing. Gatherings became healing. Laughter became healing. Storytelling became healing. And protests became healing. Marching wasn't just political, but it was emotional. It was saying, I refuse to hold this pain alone. But here's the problem. None of these forms of healing were ever labeled as mental health. So when modern conversations about therapy and wellness came along, they often felt foreign. And not because Black people didn't care about healing, but because healing always looked different. There was also a little bit of distrust, and I can't knock that. Medicine and psychology were not safe spaces for Black people historically. Forced experiments, misdiagnosis, being labeled unstable for normal reactions. We can name countless stories. So the message became, handle it in the family, handle it in the church, handle it inside yourself, which works until it doesn't. And now we're living with emotional inheritance of that silence. We see it in how families avoid talking about trauma, how depression gets called laziness, how anxiety gets called weakness, and how grief gets rushed. We didn't inherit brokenness. We inherited unfinished healing. And that's the most important difference. We're not damaged by history, we are shaped by it. But shaping can be reshaped. And before I get into our last question, I want to talk about the Black print of the week, which is Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, born Gloria Jean Watkins, was a Black feminist scholar, writer, and cultural critic who spent her life studying how race, love, trauma, community, and healing intersect. Her work focused on systems like racism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and how that shaped not just society, but our emotional lives. She didn't just write about politics. She wrote about how oppression lives inside the heart, and how healing has to be cultural, emotional, and communal, not just individual. Bell Hooks believed trauma isn't only historical, it's emotional and it's relational. Healing isn't just therapy, it's love, it's care, and it's community. And Black people were taught survival, but not always taught how to feel safely. She often talked about love as a political act, community as a healing space, vulnerability as resistance, and storytelling as a form of repair. Her work gave language to things many Black families felt but didn't name. Bell Hooks helps us understand why Black grief looks the way it does. She argued that Black communities were shaped by forced separation of families, violence, emotional suppression, and the need to appear strong in unsafe systems. That meant many Black people learned how to endure, how to perform strength, and how to hide pain, but not always how to sit with that grief, how to speak about trauma, or even be emotionally held. She didn't see this as a personal failure, though. She saw it as a historical pattern. Grief, in her view, wasn't just about loss. It was about what we were never allowed to feel openly. Bell Hooks believed healing and community and connection, not isolation. One of her most powerful ideas is that healing happens when we gather, when we share stories, and when we love each other through pain. She wrote about how church was an emotional refuge, cooking and caregiving as sacred acts, protests as collective release, and conversation as medicine. She saw all of these as forms of cultural healing long before modern mental health language caught up. To Bell Hooks, healing meant breaking that silence, naming pain, choosing love over numbness, and building spaces where Black people could be whole, not just strong. So why does Bell Hooks matter to the topic of Black grief and healing? Well, it's because Bell Hooks ties directly into this. Because when she explains why grief feels complicated, it's because we were taught survival and not softness, or why healing feels unfamiliar. And that's because systems never centered around Black emotional safety, or even where healing can begin. And she says that's in relationships, storytelling, and love and care. She reframes healing as something cultural, not just clinical. Not go fix yourself alone, but we heal together. Her voice is so important, especially right now, because it talks about generational trauma, Black mental health, grief, vulnerability, rest, and boundaries. We're walking in the language Bell Hooks helped create. She gave Black communities permission to say, pain is real, love is radical, healing is necessary, and softness is not a weakness. In short, Bell Hooks helps us understand that Black grief didn't come from nowhere, and healing doesn't have to either. She told us that grief is historical, healing is communal, and love is the bridge between them. She belongs in this conversation because she reminds us that Black healing is not just about surviving trauma. It's about learning how to live fully after it. So, here's a powerful Bell Hooks quote that connects directly to Black grief and healing. And she says, and I quote, "When we gather in church, when we cook for each other, when we protest together, when we cry together, that's communion." So we're going to break this quote down. This quote reframes healing as something collective, not individual. Bell Hooks is saying that Black healing didn't start in therapy offices or even self-help books. No, it started in shared meals, shared tears, shared faith, shared struggles, and shared space. For Black communities, grief was never meant to be carried alone, even when society forced it into silence. So let's do a line-by-line analysis of this quote, because I think it's very important to fully understand where she's coming from. So, when we gather in church, that's what she said, right? Church wasn't just religion. It was one of the only safe spaces that Black people could release pain, speak fear, cry openly, and be held emotionally. Church became emotional shelters in a world that offered none. When we cook for each other, food is care, food is memory, food is survival turned into love. Cooking is how grief becomes connection instead of isolation. It's how pain turns into presence. When we protest together, protest is an emotional release. It's grief with a voice. Marching isn't just political. It's saying, I refuse to suffer alone. My pain deserves to be seen. When we cry together, and this is the most radical part, because Black people were taught, don't cry, don't show weakness, and don't break. But crying together becomes an act of resistance. It says vulnerability is allowed here. And lastly, that's communion. Communion usually means sacred connection. Bell Hooks is redefining holiness as shared pain, shared care, and shared humanity. Healing isn't private. Healing is relational. This quote explains why Black grief often shows up in family gatherings, music, funerals, cookouts, marches, and storytelling. These are not distractions from grief, though, but these are how grief has survived. Black people didn't lack healing, they created it where they could. Today, many people think healing has to look like therapy only, or solitude, silence, or even individual work. Bell Hooks reminds us healing could look like sitting at the table, being witnessed, crying without shame, loving in community, especially in a culture that taught us to be strong instead of soft. This quote teaches us that Black healing was never just about surviving pain. Speaking of turning grief into connection and connection into survival, that brings me to our pattern breaker of the week. Can you guess? It is none other than Mamie Till Mobley. Mamie Till Mobley's decision to have an open casket for her son Emmett Till is one of the most powerful examples of how Black grief became public, political, and transformative, and why it belongs at the center of this episode about Black grief and healing. She refused to hide Black pain. Mamie Till Mobley could have grieved privately. Instead, she said, "I wanted the world to see what they did to my baby." In a culture where Black suffering was often ignored or minimized, her choice forced the nation to witness it. This connects directly to our episode and the initial question: why does Black grief feel different? Well, because for so long it was either silenced or turned into proof. Her grief became a form of storytelling. Her grief became collective grief. Remember, protests. It's important. By opening the casket, Mamie transformed a personal loss into a shared reckoning. Thousands of people attended the funeral, and millions saw the photo. This mirrors what Bell Hooks teaches about communal healing. Grief isn't meant to be carried alone. Healing happens in gathering, and pain becomes powerful when witnessed. Mamie didn't just mourn her son, she created a space for the Black community to mourn together. This shows how Black grief can turn into action. Mamie's decision helped spark the civil rights movement. Her grief became protest, told you that was important, memory, resistance, and even historical turning point. This reflects a pattern in Black culture. When grief is denied space to be soft, it becomes strong, it becomes visible, and it becomes a movement. Her choice shows how Black healing has often been forced to take shape of justice seeking instead of rest. It reveals the costs of being strong. Mamie Till Mobley carried unimaginable pain and stood in front of the world, but she had to be brave in public while breaking inside. That's the emotional inheritance many Black families still carry today. Be strong in crisis, don't collapse, turn pain into purpose. This episode asks, where does healing begin? Her story asks the next question. What happens when grief is always asked to serve a cause instead of being allowed to just be grief? So Mamie's decision teaches us grief deserves to be seen. Pain deserves language. Silence protects injustice, but witnessing can be healing. But it also challenges us. Do we still believe our grief must be public to matter? Do we still think pain has to teach a lesson to be valid? Healing today can mean something new. Grief without spectacle, mourning without mission, and softness without apology. But Mamie Till's open casket connects perfectly to this episode because it shows Black grief is historical, not just personal. Healing can often be communal and visible. Pain was turned into power because silence was not safe. And today, we can choose new ways to grieve and to heal. Her act answers my title question in a very haunting way. Where does healing begin for Black people? Sometimes it begins with refusing to hide the wound. Mamie Till Mobley's open casket shows that Black grief has always been more than mourning. It has been a demand to be seen, a call to community, and a bridge between trauma and transformation. And that brings me to my last question. Where does healing begin for Black people today? It doesn't start with perfection. It doesn't start with having money. It doesn't even start with knowing all the right words. But healing begins with permission. Permission to feel. Permission to pause. Permission to question the old rules. Healing begins when we say, maybe strength doesn't always mean silence. Maybe survival doesn't have to look like suffering. Maybe grief deserves language. Healing can start in small places, like talking honestly with your family, Going to therapy if possible, journaling. I do that. Naming emotions, setting boundaries. I do this a lot. And resting without guilt. I also do that a lot too. I can't lie. But healing can also start culturally by reclaiming rituals, honoring ancestors without glorifying pain, telling fuller stories, teaching children emotional vocabulary. Healing is not about forgetting history. Healing is learning how to carry history without letting it crush you. It's saying, I honor what my people survived, but I don't have to relive it emotionally forever. And healing doesn't mean you stop being angry. It doesn't mean you stop fighting injustice. It means you just don't let trauma be your only language. For some of us, healing starts with asking, why was I taught not to cry? For others, why do I feel guilty resting? Or why does vulnerability scare me? Those questions are not weaknesses, they're beginnings. So in closing, by now I hope one thing feels clear. Black grief didn't come from nowhere, and healing doesn't have to come from nowhere either. We come from a history of survival, but we also come from a history of creativity, community, and care. Healing begins when we let ourselves imagine something different. Not just surviving, but feeling. Not just enduring, but resting. Not just remembering pain, but creating space and creating peace. If you've ever thought, why does this feel so hard? Or, where do I even start? Well, start with understanding. Start with conversation. Start with compassion for yourself and for your people. Because healing doesn't erase history, it transforms how we live it. So, if this episode spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If this conversation matters to you, keep it going. But be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode of Black by Design. And remember, healing is not a destination, it is a practice. Bye.